The story in today's episode came to me immediately following a really great meditation last week, and while I'm not committing right now to making it into a full series because I have 3 different series on the go and 2 more in active development, I am heavily considering fleshing it out into more later on because I really love this premise, and I'm excited to see what you all think as well. So let me know in the comments if you'd want to see more of Quin Jin's quantum jumping, or QJQJ for short, and I hope you enjoy today's tale. Let's go! Hit like if you want, subscribe if you feel like, but either way, enjoy the show. Quin Jin's brain hurt every time she saw news about Victor Spess. She could hardly comprehend how her old schlubby burnout friend from high school had transformed into one of the most famous actors on the planet. She hardly even recognized him as the same person who once ate 16 Hot Pockets on a dare. Now, he was showing off his abs in fitness magazines and being his eccentric, charming self on talk shows. It also bugged her anytime she realized she was thinking about how hot he'd become. She felt like her life had had the exact opposite trajectory to his. Back in the day, she'd done well in her classes, been on the school gymnastics team, and gotten into the prestigious business program her parents had wanted for her. Unfortunately, once there, she stopped doing gymnastics because her school workload was too much, and the combination of stress from school and the lack of exercise had made her get out of shape both physically and mentally. After 2 years, against her parents' wishes, she dropped out, planning to take a year to work in a coffee shop while she figured out where to go next. All the while, she never said it to anyone, she'd just been hoping her webcomic, a manhwa called The Arcturian's Shutterbug, would take off and she could start earning a living off of it. Though she didn't believe that would ever actually be possible for her. She'd seen the quality of other manga, manhwa, and comic artists who were quote-unquote real professionals and had just accepted that she'd always be an amateur. Her 1 year off to figure things out had turned into 2, then 5, and now she was just in the habit of her life and figured that this was what her life would always be. That is until the day, after years of watching his career from afar, she finally heard Victor Spess's voice again, in person, from behind some thick sunglasses and a hat, trying to stay incognito. Hi there, maybe this is a weird question to ask, but is this one of those places that has like a secret menu? Because I love that. Wait, hold it, stop it, wait, 1 gargantuan minute. If his voice hadn't been quite enough for her to notice it was him when he dramatically whipped off his glasses, she knew for sure it was Victor Spess. She went beet red, surprisingly, as if he were there confronting her about how much she'd stalked him online over the years, even though there was no way for him to know that. Is that you, Quinn? Yeah, wow. Hi, Victor, it's good to Before she could say anything else, though, 2 girls in a booth nearby screamed in excitement seeing Victor Spess in the coffee shop. He glanced back at Quinn. Right. Never a good idea to take off the shades inside. This happens, my public calls, but you, me, hanging out while I'm in town. Tomorrow, lunch, catching up, bowling, ? Drinks, if you want them, all mine will be virgin because I don't do booze, but can't wait to catch up. Without ordering, he then turned to the girls who had run up to him and started listening as they gushed over how amazing he was in various roles and took pictures with him, which then prompted more people to notice who he was and come over, and eventually, he ended up leaving without even getting a drink, but on his way out, made sure to point back at Quinn. You me tomorrow, Quinny, whenever you're free, I'm free all day. You've still got my number, right? She thought he might just be being polite, but that night he texted her to confirm plans on where they should meet. She picked an old diner where she sometimes went to draw when she was desperate to not be in her apartment or at work. It was rarely busy and most of the clientele were much older and less likely to recognize Victor. She had actually considered trying to back out the following day. It embarrassed her to think that she'd have to say what had become of her life, while his had clearly gone so well since they'd last seen each other. She hoped he'd spend most of the time talking about himself and his own career, and she wouldn't have to talk about herself at all. But once he arrived and gave her a huge hug, he seemed far more interested in hearing about how she'd been than talking about his own success. It was surprisingly polite, but also annoying considering that she felt she had nothing interesting to say. I'm just at the coffee shop for a bit longer, hopefully, until I finally, figure out where I'm going from there. I'm kind of hoping, maybe I'll be able to make a bit of money off the Arcturian's Shutterbug, but I'm not really trying to or anything. Okay, stop that. You have to. It is so good. Or at least the first 10 chapters are. I read them last night. You have to get it out there more so it can get famous, it can become a movie or a series, and I can play the main guy Lerastos because he's a gem and I already have his hair. Quinn felt even more embarrassed hearing that he'd read it, especially because she had sort of based the main guy's look on Victor. It was a series about a photographer named Tara Lee, who was not so subtly meant to be Quinn's stand-in in the story, who had met a handsome rogue alien from a race called the Arcturians. They're not meant to interact with humans directly in the series, but Lerastos is a rebel among his people and just wants to go on adventures on Earth and across the galaxy. Tara finds him exploring Earth while she's out doing some nature photography and takes his picture multiple times. He loves what she captured of him and asks her to come on adventures with him and capture images of all the incredible stuff he finds and does. She agrees and goes with him, and a romance very, very slowly blooms between them over the course of their travels. That's nice of you to have read it and say that, Victor, but it's never gonna be that big. He smirked and leaned in. Tell me something, in high school, would you have ever said I'd be a good enough actor to get any of the roles that I'm in now? She didn't say it this way, but her internal response was absolutely zero chance. Victor had been in all the school's plays and was certainly energetic in his roles, but was far from a skilled actor. She simply said, no, I guess not, but you're great now. Exactly, and don't get me wrong, these definitely help. He lifted up his shirt and showed off his shredded abs. Quinn immediately blushed. What do you do? Stop, we're in public. You see this? Look at this. Look what I can do with him. He started rolling his stomach muscles like a wave, and Quinn's embarrassment grew and grew, but she also didn't look away. Finally, he lowered his shirt. But I got better at acting, and you can get better at drawing the exact same way and be the next, insert name of famous comic book artist here. I don't know any of them, sorry. But have you ever heard of a saucy little thing called quantum jumping? She'd heard about it in passing. Her Manhwa idea had pulled some inspiration from new agey ideas about aliens, and from that she'd seen a few recommended videos and articles on quantum jumping meditations and explanations, but had never actually watched or read any of them. Okay, think about this, go with me on this, don't stop the train, just let those train wheels roll, follow me here. He knocked his knuckle on the table. Okay, now in our reality, I did that just now, but there is also a reality where I did that 1 millisecond earlier, and another where I did it 1 millisecond later, and so on and so on and so on forever and ever for every possible change you, me, or anyone or anything could do differently, right? I mean, I've heard that that's a theory, but... No, don't pump those brakes. I know the emergency brakes on this train say fine for misuse, but that doesn't mean it's fine to misuse them. I've learned that the hard way. Anyway, there are infinite versions of you, and plenty of them are incredibly successful artists, right? Just like there were tons of versions of me that were fantastic, world-famous actors, while I was just here in our reality being a bum who could chug a liter of soda in under 30 seconds, and I can't do that now because I only drink water and coffee. Yeah, maybe a bit too much coffee? Fair, funny, you're still great. But listen, quantum jumping is where you get into a deep meditative state and literally let your soul leave our reality, go to another one where you're successful, and copy a part of that life's blueprint and bring it back into your own life here in our reality. It doesn't happen overnight, but you do it enough and eventually you've got shredded abs and are being invited to parties where celebrities are doing things I'm not allowed to even talk about in public, or someone will find me, put a bag over my head, throw me in the jungle, and let The Rock hunt me for sport. That's a fun idea, Victor, but there's no way that actually works. He grinned. Okay, fair. It sounds crazy because, when you don't know, you don't know, but let me ask you this, Quinn. He leaned in again. What have you got to lose? Quinn couldn't believe she was actually considering it, but after they parted ways, the idea had stuck in her head. She did have some vague spiritual beliefs and had a sense that life was weirder than it seemed on a physical surface level, but she also thought, even if what he was saying was possible, it would never actually work for her. That night, though, while binge-watching a show she didn't care about and working on her manhwa, she got a text from Victor that was a link to a quantum jumping meditation he used, meant to do while you're going to sleep. She still thought it was silly, but also figured, like he said, what was the downside to trying? She got ready for bed, set her morning alarm, put her headphones on, and started the meditation. It instructed her to focus on specific areas inside of her body for a couple moments at a time, then to focus on the space outside her and around those parts, both getting her to relax her body and to start disconnecting from it. Regardless of whether she believed it would work, she was surprised by how relaxed it made her feel pretty quickly, so she kept with it. She couldn't see anything with her eyes closed, but after a while she had a sort of sense that her consciousness was floating around her, no longer directly tied inside her body. She also kind of felt like she was just making it up, but she let herself stay with the feeling. Eventually, still unable to see anything, she felt a sense that there were infinite versions of her, lying in meditation all around her, going on for eternity. For some reason, she felt too anxious about the idea of trying to go into a version of her life where she was a successful artist, so instead her mind fell onto a smaller goal: being back in her gymnastics shape from high school. She'd always liked being able to flip through the air and do cartwheels on beams, and now she could hardly even touch her feet. She was instructed in the meditation to both think about the reality she wanted, then feel as though she were already in it. She did as instructed, then, almost like being yanked across the infinite space around her, she felt herself fly into her body. But not exactly her body. She still couldn't see anything, and again, had a sense this may just be her imagination going wild in a sleepy state, but she did genuinely feel she'd just jumped into another version of herself. It was as though she was regaining all of this version's memories. This one had stuck with gymnastics and now went to a parkour gym twice a week and would occasionally compete in competitions. She genuinely felt like she was back in a fit, tone, healthy body and enjoyed every second of that feeling. At some point, though, she must have fallen asleep, as the next morning she woke up to her alarm blaring in her ears through the headphones. She sat up and remembered that feeling she'd had, but then threw off the covers, looked down, and saw that, of course, she was back in her not-so-fit and healthy body. She groaned a bit as she got up and went to the kitchen to make breakfast, intending to just throw some cereal into a bowl and start eating, but oddly, when she opened the cabinet and reached to grab the box, she felt a bit queasy. She still took it out, but all the while she poured the cereal and the milk into the bowl, she felt sort of grossed out by it. She took her first bite and nearly spat it out. It hadn't gone bad or anything, but tasted as if someone had dumped an extra 3 pounds of sugar into it. It was a sugary cereal, but she ate it almost every day and had never noticed such a strong, overpowering taste. She tried another bite, but still it tasted sweeter than any dessert she'd ever had. She dumped it out and looked around at her limited other options. She had some bananas, which she often bought with the intention to eat them, but rarely actually did, and decided to peel one. She took a bite of that, and it too tasted sweeter than she remembered bananas usually tasting, but this time in a good way, unlike the cereal. She cut it up, threw it in a bowl with some yogurt and peanut butter, and ate that as her breakfast, and was surprised by how delicious it was. She glanced at the clock mid-meal and noticed that it was only 6:30, still an hour earlier than she'd needed to get up for work. She was surprised she hadn't felt more tired getting up so much earlier than usual, but more so she was surprised that she had set her alarm for the wrong time. She never did that. She didn't have quite enough extra time to get much done art-wise, so an unusual thought popped into her head. What if I walk to work today? She usually took the bus and it was about 15 minutes through city traffic, but the walk was only around 45. She finished getting ready, threw on some music, and went off on the walk. About a half hour in, she was surprised by how nice it felt not being crammed into a sweaty bus with the usual morning crowds. But things got even better when, on her way, she passed a place she'd never noticed before called Valiant Vaulters. It was a parkour gym, right there on her way to work. She was ahead of schedule, so she popped in and grabbed a flyer they had near the front desk. It showed that they had all kinds of classes, including a beginner's course. Back in her gymnastics days, a beginner's course would have been way beneath her, but now, having not done much movement exercises in years, it actually seemed pretty appealing. She stuck the flyer in her pocket and continued about her day, most of it being the same as usual. But once work was done, she decided to walk home as well. By the time she was drawing back at her apartment with the evening winding down, she realized that she felt better than usual. She talked herself out of the idea that the quantum jumping had actually worked, saying that it was all coincidence, that the parkour gym must have come to her mind because she had subconsciously seen it on her way to work before. But still, she went ahead and did it again that night. And the next night. Over those first 3 days, she found she had to buy all new groceries as her body was completely rejecting her usual pizza pockets and cereals and ice creams. She even went to a trial class at the Valiant Vaulters and felt a bit embarrassed by how poorly she moved now compared to her old self, but found her body was regaining the flow of the old movements faster than she would have expected. She also finally texted Victor, telling him she was doing the meditations and saying she didn't think any crazy quantum stuff was happening, but she was feeling more motivated in general and intended to keep them up. He replied by saying, "That's exactly how that starts, Quinn. You're getting your first synchronicities. Wait till you see where it goes." For the next month, despite her skepticism, Quinn kept on that track, doing the meditation every night and doing what she felt compelled to as a result. She rationalized it to herself that by going to bed focusing on being a healthier version of herself, her brain was spending its days more inclined to do things that helped her feel that way. But regardless of why it was working, it was working. Quinn didn't own a scale, but had eventually noticed one at the parkour gym, and when she weighed herself, found that she must have dropped at least 15 pounds in that month alone. She also felt way more energized and her mood was way better. She was still not quite able to move as fluidly as she once had, but felt if she kept on this track for another few months, she would blow right on past her old skill level in fitness. Before starting the meditations, Quinn thought she was never going to be in good shape again. She'd written it off that now that she was in her mid-20s, it was all downhill for her metabolism. But seeing the changes that had happened just from altering some elements of her daily routines, she figured maybe other parts of her life really could change dramatically too. She decided to start doing the meditations focusing on becoming a successful artist, not yet going so far as to picture herself with Victor's level of success and fame, but trying to jump into a version of herself who is making a living off of the Arcturian's Shutterbug. She went through the routine of settling her body and disconnecting from it, and, while it did still feel a lot of the time like she was making up what was happening, did manage to settle into a version of her where her manhwa had gone viral and a company had come to her asking to publish it. From there, she'd started going to comic convention circuits and was making a great living off her art and stories. The next morning, she woke up feeling great. She ate a healthy breakfast, walked to work with some good music, but did feel very disconnected from her job when she was there. It felt more like a waste of time than usual, but she also knew she definitely still needed the money and stuck it out, letting her mind often slip away into story ideas she'd develop when she got home. When she did get back to her place and got down to drawing, she did feel like she was working faster and more deliberately than usual. But the changes didn't seem as dramatic as they had with her fitness. Still, she kept at it. She even started into a new storyline, which would mean she'd have to draw a big, futuristic alien city. Quinn had wanted to do this storyline for years, but hated drawing and designing buildings so much that she'd always avoided it. Now, though, she felt it was finally time to try it. She did some tutorials on perspective and looked at a bunch of different sci-fi concept art of cities, and finally dove into it. Her buildings didn't look great, and she was still a bit slow with them, but she also thought they looked a lot better than she thought they would, so she kept on going and trying to improve with them. Another month later, Quinn still didn't feel like she'd gotten any closer to earning a living off of her manhwa, but she definitely felt she had improved. Plus, she'd kept on track with her new health routines and felt physically better than she had even back in high school. She even started to see those lines appearing along the sides of her stomach. They weren't Victor's abs, but she was in fantastic shape. The old her likely would have felt a bit too nervous to message Victor, not wanting to bother him, but he was still in town and apparently would be for a few more months. He was shooting a live-action series with a major production company in the city, and had also signed on to do voice work in an animated project of theirs. He was voicing a character named Flamtatius Staphos from a book series Quinn had loved as a kid about a superhero fighting league called Vigilants. Those two projects were keeping Victor in town, so a little over 2 months after they'd first met up, she messaged asking if he could meet up again. He was very enthusiastic too, so they met up at the same diner as last time. She told him all about her improvements since starting quantum jumping meditations. She did admit, though, that she still didn't see a path to making a living off of her comic. She still didn't think it would ever be at professional level. Well, Quinn, you know who did think your comic looked real profesh is Linda Vervardi, the creative director on Vigilants Season 1. I was reading the latest chapter at the studios yesterday, and she caught a read of it over my shoulder and asked me who made it. Turns out they're looking for a new storyboard artist as soon AP because the last guy they hired had used AI to generate all the backgrounds in his portfolio and wasn't cutting it. So tomorrow, you, me, studio, meeting the creative director, the job is basically yours. If you want it, you are welcome. Quinn was floored. It wasn't making a living off the Arcturian's shutterbug yet, but if she could spend her days drawing, she would improve 10 times faster than she had been. Plus, making connections with people at a major animation studio would mean, if her comic did get popular, there was that much more of a chance of it getting turned into an animated series someday. Quinn was practically bouncing out of her seat the entire meal and must have thanked him 50 times, but he kept saying that he didn't do it. She did it by quantum jumping. She went and met with Ms. Vervardi and the next day was hired on the spot at the end of that interview. They needed someone fast, and Vervardi even said to get Quinn's speed up with her drawings, they'd have one of their more senior artists give her a few lessons. Quinn learned so much in that first week alone and was quickly able to translate that into her own comic. Soon, other artists in the office heard about her comic, and many started reading it. Everyone had incredible things to say about it and started sharing it with more and more people. Her readership on the Manhwa was growing, and all the while, her health and fitness were still improving as well, and she could very clearly see how much better her art had gotten in those last few months alone. 3 months after starting the quantum jumping meditations, Quinn's entire life had transformed into something almost unrecognizable. She finally started to accept that maybe she really was quantum jumping into other realities and bringing something back to her own timeline. It got to a point where she began to wonder, what other dramatically different versions of her could be out there? Maybe she could get story ideas by jumping into versions of her that lived the same kinds of lives as what she'd write about or read about in other people's comics and science fiction stories. With her work and her fitness well on track, she decided to try doing more exploring in her meditations. She decided to try and see if there was a version of her that had superpowers. Likely because her mind was heavily embedded in her work on Vigilants, she found she actually projected into a version of her that seemed to be living in a world where that story was a reality. As usual, she couldn't see anything when she projected into this other her's mind, but from the memories she absorbed from that version of her, she could sense that she had developed superpowers in that world to create physical light constructs, similar to one of the characters from the Vigilance series in her own world, Fesmanara. The main difference was, she had to actually draw her manifestations into the air with her hands before using them. It seemed part of her artistic talents had been translated into this reality as well. She also felt that, funny enough, she was an old friend of Flamtatius Staphos in this world, the character Victor was playing in the show. The next night, she tried to see if there was a version of her that had interacted with aliens before. She then felt herself going into a version of her that was some kind of sci-fi military operator, using her incredible gymnastic skills to help her fight against an allegedly invading alien force called the Cusidians. All the while, this version of her was making an autobiographical comic about her experiences in the war, but also expressed some skepticism about whether or not the aliens they were fighting were actually the bad guys. That one had been particularly exciting and great story idea fuel, but it made Quinn wonder, if there were really infinite versions of her, then was there a version of her that was living out the life of the main character from her comic? She decided to search for that the next night. She had a great evening of drawing with her window wide open, listening to the sounds of a heavy storm. She always loved working with the sound of rain behind her, and it calmed her even more leading up to going into her meditation. She got ready for bed, lay down, and started to slip out of her body. She was ecstatic to find that she was indeed able to leap right into another version of her who was still going by the name Quin Jin, but seemed to have a nearly identical life to that of Tara Lee from her comic The Arcturian's Shutterbug. She could feel and remember all her experiences of having left Earth with Lorastos and traveling to exciting and dangerous planets. Quinn started to feel her body slipping off into sleep, but forced herself to stay conscious longer, not wanting to leave this reality. She could feel the immense romantic tension between her and Lorastos that was likely to soon bloom into something more. She stayed in the mind of this other reality's Quinn for longer than she'd ever lingered in a meditation before. Long enough for something strange to occur. Simultaneously, in Quinn's home reality and in the other one was a massive crash. In her world, it was a crack of lightning, loud enough to wake anybody from sleep. In the other, at the exact same millisecond, was the roar of some kind of alien beast, also loud enough to wake the dead. Quinn immediately sat up with her heart pounding from the shock. But she didn't sit up in her apartment bedroom. Quinn looked around her to see that she was in some kind of chrome tent, asleep on a squishy cot bed. She just remained still for a moment, thinking she was seeing things. She thought maybe she was dreaming or had just reached a new level of her quantum jumping where she could actually see the other realities. But this was far more than that. There was another monstrous cry from outside, and she noticed stomping footsteps coming closer. The door of the tent was flung open, and running in came what sounded very clearly like Victor, but also looked like a very real version of Lerastos. Quin Jin, sorry to wake you up, but we've gotta go. I may or may not, but definitely have riled up the Borikuba, and it's also, obviously, as always, very hungry. He ran to the center of the tent and hit a blue button on the ground. The ceiling suddenly started folding in triangular patterns in on itself and came down the walls and the floor, and soon the entire thing was gone, collapsed inside the box. And Quinn was just lying on a cot in a forest with blue trees and a lime green sky. She finally started to realize she could not just see, but feel and hear everything. This was real. This was as real as anything she had ever felt before. Lerastos came over to her and she jumped up out of the bed, somehow knowing that he was about to fold it up too into a backpack. Of course, as she got up, the covers fell off her, showing that she was in some unusually revealing and tight pajamas. They were not something she'd ever wear to bed in her own world, but she also very clearly remembered designing them, thinking she'd look hot in them, intending to write this exact sort of scenario. She quickly tried to cover herself up. Don't look, He just smirked and tapped a button on the side of the cot. It folded up into a backpack just as she'd expected. Oh, looking good there, Earthling, but let me get you something more protective than that. From the bag he'd just folded up, he pulled out a metal disc and tossed it to Quinn. She caught it, and again knew exactly what it was, setting it right on her waist, and from it unfolded a spacesuit, which also seemed impractically tight, yet she could move just as freely in it as she'd always imagined. She was astounded looking at herself, but before she could revel too much in it, she noticed how close the thudding, sloshing steps were getting. There was another roar behind her. She whipped around to see a tentacle-legged monster with crab-like claws charging towards her. A futuristic camera was then suddenly thrust into her hands. Safety over picks as always, but I know you'll never let me hear the end of it if I don't let you capture something here. Now work those legs and let's go! He pushed her in the opposite direction of the creature and she started to sprint away, moving incredibly quickly and feeling as nimble as a gazelle. This suit was exactly like the one she had written in her comic, making her able to move faster and leap higher. Plus, if this version of her was just like Tara from her own comic, then she was also very naturally agile and quick. The two ran for their lives away from the charging creature, and Quinn couldn't help but laugh. This really was real. Quantum jumping was real, but she had just taken it to a whole other level. The only problem was, would she ever be able to get back home? So what do you think? Would you want a full series out of Quin Jin's quantum jumping? Let me know in the comments. The two other series that I have in active development that would likely come first are Starseed Psyche, which the pilot episode got referenced in this, and a Trismegistus Academy storyline set in Multiverse Tales. I also have a demon and horror story idea that I'm kinda kicking around but not sure about that, but like I said, this could be a full series too. If you're new here and you enjoyed this, I highly recommend checking out Vigilants, which has a very similar tone and themes, but I also have tons of other art and story episodes that you might enjoy. Hundreds of them. If you want a really long series to binge, you could start Multiverse Tales from the beginning. But besides that, that's all for today, except of course for ending this video on some kind of positive or inspiring note, and the thought I want to leave people with is kind of part of what was mixed, or it is part of what was mixed into this episode, and that's just a recommendation to start meditating regularly. A little over 3 years ago, I started meditating daily, and I've talked about this on the channel before, but my life has become so much better as a result, both in terms of my mental and physical health. Before I started meditating daily, I used to get semi-regular anxiety attacks, and after I started meditating about a month in, never gotten one since. Been 3 years now. And whether you want to look at it on a spiritual level or just motivation level, I do feel that meditation has had a huge impact on the success I've had with my career with this channel. And doing them first thing in the morning really just helps me set up my mind to look at my day from a more positive lens, regardless of whether I have to do something that I know I'm going to enjoy or something that might not be so fun. And it's important to remember that if you're like me and you have a very active and noisy mind, when your mind kicks up some thoughts during a meditation, you're doing it right if you hear those thoughts and just settle back into the meditation. That can happen over and over and over again, and that doesn't mean you're doing something wrong, it means you're doing something right. And over time, you're going to get better at having your mind just settle into a peaceful mindscape. That's probably not the right word, but that's what came to me.